Hey, welcome back. I know it's been a while. I've mostly just been sitting around doing nothing. Yeah, welcome back though.
Do you have the time to listen to me grind? Take down the film watchers and nerds all at once. I am one of those, skeptical of status quo. Bayesian to the bone, no doubt about it.
So I wanted to start back off with something easy to ease myself back into the YouTube grind. And something came up in the Dynasty Crossroads actually just before the podcast. I think it was on Wednesday, 9:30 p.m. Every Wednesday we do a live stream with Dynasty Outhouse and Zach Reed from the Dynasty Dummies podcast answering questions. And something me and Zach both kind of arrived at the same time was talking about how this class reminds us of something. And we both had the same idea for what we would do if we were doing a startup right now, and which we were both kind of tempted to do some startups and try it. And so, I want to talk to you about that. Let me bend some history round to the story I want it to be and then pretend that it's absolute fact. Does anyone remember 2016? In 2016, we saw a 4-year decline at the running back position. We'd actually seen a pretty much stable stagnation into 17 points per game in the top 12. Wide receivers were popping off fairly heavily in the first 3 years, and it was the era of the 2014 wide receiver class, essentially, where, the great new wide receivers are here. A lot of content was dedicated to how wide receivers were taking over and whether there was a trend or a more immediate trend in the rate at which the NFL was passing, and whether this would ever bounce back. I have tended to take a broader view, but this was pretty early on, especially in my Dynasty career, taking that broader view, and so I don't have a lot of content to call back to from that era, but I do remember 2016 because it was kind of a bounce back year for running backs. Now, if any of that sounds familiar, it should, because of the last 4 years from today, we've seen an increasing decline instead of a stagnation in the top 12 running backs. In fact, last year we saw the lowest points per game that the top 12 running backs has ever put up since I think ever since 2009, and it's been steadily declining since 2018, so there's where that 4-year decline comes up. For example, Antonio Gibson did increase his opportunity share last year a little bit more than I thought, but within the range, but he fell into the top 12, which I really thought was outside his likely range of outcomes, but it felt like the running back position dropped to him instead of he elevated into it. That's one of the ways that I tended, or that I started thinking about the running back position last year. Now, why am I telling you about 2016? Because 2016 was a bit of a bounce back year. We had Jay Ajayi, we had David Johnson, and a young rookie Ezekiel Elliott really bringing the position back. However, if you were drafting at that time, a lot of mistakes could have been made. We're about to bet heavily on year 3 and 4 players because of their first 3 years in the league from the 2014 class, some of which would start to struggle, not because that's what happens after your 3rd year, but the number of times you roll the dice or start a career year, the more stuff, or the more probable it is something random's going to happen. So in that way, maybe it is a little bit more likely the further career goes on. Probably have to cut that bit. Again, I'm out of practice. But what really happened is, if you were drafting at that time, we made a lot of mistakes with young wide receivers because of our tendency to think in 3 and 4 year windows instead of 10 and 20 year windows. We bet on using wide receivers as if they could never falter, even though, we have no idea of knowing that. And some of those young breakout running backs, some of which came from lower draft capital like David Johnson, and some were slightly surprising like Jay Ajayi. Ezekiel Elliott is still, he only just dropped to the dead zone for the first time, so he was a success story from that year. A lot of things are reminding me about the 2016 class or year, the more I look into 2022 in terms of touchdown rates, in terms of passing rates, in terms of the pattern of RB production over the last 4 years. If you look at breakouts, which I've been researching heavily over the last few weeks, and hopefully you managed to check out some of that content, I don't know. One of the things I found is that unlike last year, where we were kind of due, especially in the 3rd year breakout wide receivers, which are actually the most common breakout group for a high level of production anyway, but we'll talk about that another time. There's no real trend that we can really bet on regressing at the wide receiver position. Unless you like players outside their 4th career year with lower draft capital, which I tend to, but I'm not going to drag you into that just yet because it's a fairly low hit rate group. But that is the place at the wide receiver position that we've actually been hitting on a little less. We've been seeing fewer breakouts with 4th year players outside the 3rd round of the NFL draft a little less often than even we see them typically, even though it's a lower hit rate group. That's where the wide receivers are seeing significant regression due, let's just call it that. However, having said that, 5 to 6 wide receivers break out every year. About half the top 12 are actually new players who've never emerged into the top 12 before for the first time, and actually a similar number exists for running back position. Why am I going into this? Because there is something that was strongly dissimilar at the running back positions, a trend that we can bet should regress next year, and that's breakout running backs. Last year we saw more return and repeat running backs than we typically see, and not like a little bit, but like a lot. Again, the consistency of the top 12 being 50% repeat players and return players are why Team Old Guy works. It's why good players tend to make up the majority percentage of fantasy seasons, because good players tend to declare themselves pretty early, pretty quickly. We know who they are, and then you're just rolling the dice on that real life stuff and the rest of the offense to help support them. The other 50% of the top 12, both running back and wide receiver, are players who are emerging there for the first time. And there are different trends, but both of those groups tend to be messy. There are very few commonalities with any of them that you can draw a straight line on. With wide receiver, I really think career year is one of the best indications that we have, outside of deciding that numbers are magical. Running back, career year also works fairly strongly, and so does some level of previous production, but running backs break out so early that in fact, so do wide receivers, but we're talking about running backs right now, that you really don't see a lot before it happens. That's kind of why I was but I didn't like the hype on Antonio Gibson last year. I felt like we'd already seen him elevate into the role, and so my expectations that there was upside in that was slightly diminished because he hadn't already elevated into that top 12 level of performance, which he did, but again, once you take into account the running back position, it felt like the points per game dropped to him more than he elevated up to the typical standard top 12 points per game. So where was I? Yeah, I'll throw up a picture here, I guess, of what I'm talking about. The trend at running backs is that we saw more repeat and return running backs who've been in the top 12 before and had another top 12 season last year, despite having not been in the top 12 in 2020. So they didn't repeat, they returned. And a distinct lack of breakouts at the running back position. In fact, if you look at the breakout running backs last year, or remember them, picture probably, one of them's Cordero Patterson, one of them's Aaron Jones as a return running back, and one of them's Leonard Fournette, who switched teams entirely. And despite the fact we're always hoping that running backs can switch teams to find another opportunity, James Conner this year maybe and Leonard Fournette are actually fairly rare for maintaining that level of workload on a second team in another offense. Most don't. But we'll talk about that another time as well, I guess. Again, it's been a while since I was on YouTube. Give me a break. So what I think I'm expecting for the 2022 season is similar to that 2016 season, because this rookie class isn't particularly stellar by all accounts, but there are some shining lights that we think are under or overvalued or whatever else. It's very likely Breece Hall, maybe even Kenneth Walker. I mean, Jordan Howard broke out in 2016, for example, just to draw an extra parallel that's completely unjustified, but why not? But even deeper down, Isaiah Spiller, some of these deeper running backs could have outsized opportunity in 2022 just because of the state of the running back position right now, and drawing some parallels to previous thing that's happened. History doesn't repeat itself. It's not a circle. Sorry, I'm going into my historian era. We just don't need to go there. But yeah, history doesn't repeat itself that directly, but I think it would be foolish when you're seeing such commonalities to production trends not to expect some level of that in 2022. And even if we just remove the 2016 comparison, then just the state of the running back and wide receiver position next year should expect we see more repeats next year. We should still expect, by the way, we haven't seen less than 3 wide receivers break out into the top 12 forever. There's never been less than 3. Right now, DLF, or Dynasty ADP and Redraft ADP, are attempted to project 2. And this is actually a commonality to ADP. We are too timid about projecting new players in the top 12, whereas if we want to be more accurate, you're going to have to predict 3 or 4 at minimum every year. Now this year I think 3 would be more reasonable than say 5, but 2 is definitely under. And now the 2 most likely are actually the 2 that have been elevated into the top 12 in Dynasty ADP, and that's T. Higgins and CeeDee Lamb, but that's a conversation for another video as well. But at the running back position, we're also projecting very few breakouts, and based on what happened in 2021, we should strongly expect that to regress in 2022. Now that brings me back to the subject of the video. What would I do, or what would Zach Reed do, or what do we think we would want to try if we were starting a brand new Dynasty League today before the 22 season starts? I would tank. 2022 is going to be a rough year, and I think a lot of startups, and especially during and after the season, are going to make a lot of mistakes based on what recently happened, thinking in a 3-year window instead of seeing the broader 10 and 20-year window that I think is more accurate for understanding how trends are likely to change for any given season. In other words, if I was in a startup right now, I would trade up and I would trade down. I would target draft picks really heavily and youth, and I would mostly fade the running back position. Now this sounds like every Dynasty player ever, right? Hopefully you're not new, but actually no, scratch that. Hopefully you are new to the channel. I could use with a new subscriber, to be honest. Like and subscribe, please. But if not, if you've seen some of my content before, hopefully you know, and if you haven't, I just want to point out that while that is just basically a vague version of every Dynasty content you've ever heard, I have literally never said that. I've never said just target young wide receivers. I've never said productive struggle is the way I draft every way. Instead, I lean much more the other way more often. I want to win now. I want to try and win the first year. I want the older players that I already know are good, and I want to focus breakouts that are less predictive and less valued in Dynasty because they're outside their typical window. That's honestly why I was on a lot of third-year breakouts last year, because Deontay Johnson and Deebo Samuel, who are both in the window, were disliked because people think they can read the future. I just don't think I can read the future. That's my great sin. So going into 2022, without trying to read the future, I think what we should expect, just from what has happened most often and what is most reasonable to expect based on what happened in 2021, what we currently understand the 2022 rookie draft to be, is that we're going to see some running back breakouts who are probably going to be co-opted by better players in the 2023 rookie class, and we're going to see some loss at the running back position, while we do expect some returns every year. At least 2 players return, even at running back, into the top 12 every year, and so Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey are still well on their path as long as they can remain uninjured for a decent number of games. But I do think we should expect more running back breakouts and slightly fewer wide receiver breakouts, but it's almost not worth mentioning that because currently we're not expecting nearly enough, and so actually we should probably expect more. And I think 2022 is a year to fade the typical trends of Dynasty wide receivers, or Dynasty play in general. I don't want to bet on the typical types of assets we bet on in Dynasty right now, heading into the 2022 class. I think we're going to see heavy changeover at the wide receiver position and the running back position over the next 2 years. I think any bet we make very strongly this year is going to be more likely wrong by the end of next year. Now, if you're trying to win, there's still a path, and we'll talk about that in some of the subjects I brought up in this one. I want to start bringing up, because I definitely want to try and win every year. Again, I'm not normally the fade this year guy, or the just go for value, or just play safe. In Dynasty, I'm about mitigating risk or managing it rather than trying to avoid it. And I think the best way of doing that this year is to take some less value players who definitely have a lower value in the future, but are actually just as likely or have just as reasonable expectations based on where they're at in their career to have a outsized production for where you're going to get them and the value you can get them for. And really play into next year. You can do both this year, but we kind of have to do it inside out instead of following the typical trends. If I was in a Dynasty startup right now, I'd do studs and duds, and I would heavily target, if the rookie picks are in the draft, those are what I would be heavily targeting after like the third round, and mostly I'd want to trade my second and third and fourth round picks and go heavy bimodal, if that's a word, of having first round picks and then a dearth of them where the rookie picks may fall. And this is a year to try and fade the most popular Dynasty assets, because I think we're going to start getting a few things wrong long term, even if we continue to get a few things right short term. Is that clear? I expect a lot of running back breakouts this year, or a lot more running back breakouts than we saw last year, and I think that might be slightly undervalued. And I expect more stability at the wide receiver position, but we should still probably expect a few more wide receiver breakouts. Who and why? Well, you can check out my podcast or my other content. I've written most of this up for DLF already, although I do have to write up tight ends. They're a little harder to pin down. They're a lot more easy to predict position, but they are a lot more volatile, so the trends aren't as stable year over year. For example, we only see 22% variance inside the makeup of the top 12 at the wide receiver and running back position year over year using a measurement called coefficient of variation. That's actually incredibly stable when you're literally just looking at positional ranks and the types of players, whether they're repeating, returning, or breaking out. That's one of the reasons I continue to rely on it. But yeah, check out some of that stuff. Ask me questions below if any of it didn't make sense. I think this is an interesting time to do a startup, because you can employ some typical productive struggle like Dynasty, which I think really were birthed by the era of 2016, and the letdown of that class and the disappointment after such a great wide receiver class came into 2014. And then the year after 2016, one of the reasons I think some of those running backs started to foul out and feel like losses if we drafted them that year, was we had the 2017 running back class, and that era that has slowly started to fade over only the last 4 years, and we still have a couple more years of them being in the league. Anyway, I feel like this was meant to be a very direct, simple video. I hope it is. Again, I'm getting back into the YouTube grind. Let me know if that was concise and interesting enough. Again, the next series of videos are going to be not series, but the next few videos I really want to dig into some of the elements that I'm talking about here, what I'm expecting in 2022, what I found out about breakouts. But I don't just want to roll out the typical breakouts are everywhere, because sleepers still suck, but we do underestimate how many new players we get every year. The stability of those who are already good is still remarkably strong. The state of our old guys is good, if I can pretend I'm doing a State of the Union. But at the same time, we underestimate how many new players we see every year. Is that this is not the year to bet on the best Dynasty like breakouts. And again, that's probably going to be a subject of the next video, like why CeeDee Lamb, or why not CeeDee Lamb. Yeah, it's an interesting question right now. But yeah, let me know what you think. Thanks very much, and I will endeavor to, not disappear for 2 weeks again. Appreciate it. Bye. Hey, thanks for checking out another video. If you could like, subscribe, comment, that'd all be great. But also check out the rest of the channels. I follow my Patreon link to see what I'm up to over there. And the Linktree link, I guess, is going to take you to easy access to my podcast, the articles I'm writing over there at DLF, as well as most of the other things I'm up to. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much.